A woman in black motorcycle gear was pulled over on an empty stretch of road, and within 3 minutes she was standing in handcuffs while strangers filmed her with their phones raised high. The officer who cuffed her laughed when she said her name was Judge Naomi Brooks of the United States Federal Court, and nobody around her believed a word of it. He told her that anyone could say anything, that a title meant nothing without proof, and he ordered her motorcycle loaded onto a tow truck, as though the matter were already settled. But just as that tow truck rolled forward to haul her motorcycle away, 3 black federal SUVs came screaming down the road, and by the next morning, an entire corrupt network inside the police department had collapsed into ruins, taking careers, reputations, and criminal empires down with it. Naomi Brooks was 42 years old, and inside the courtroom, she was known as one of the most exacting federal judges in the state, a woman who read every page of every filing before she ever raised her gavel. She never wore her title outside those walls. She did not drive a luxury sedan, did not flash jewelry, did not let anyone guess what she did for a living unless the moment called for it. The only indulgence she allowed herself was a black sport motorcycle, fast and lean, which she rode on weekends to burn off the pressure that came with deciding other people's futures for a living. She had earned her seat on the federal bench after nearly 2 decades of work that began in a public defender's office and carried her through years as a prosecutor before a nomination finally placed her behind the highest desk in the courtroom. Colleagues described her as fair to the point of severity, a judge who gave equal scrutiny to a first-time defendant and a seasoned corporate attorney, refusing to let reputation or resources sway the outcome of any case. Clerks who worked under her learned quickly that she expected precision in everything, from citations to courtroom decorum, and that she extended that same discipline to herself without exception. Away from the bench, she lived quietly in a modest home near the edge of the city, avoiding the kind of public visibility that many in her position seemed to crave. Riding was the one place where nobody addressed her as Your Honor, where the wind and the open road asked nothing of her except focus, and where the weight of other people's verdicts finally lifted from her shoulders for an hour or 2 at a time. That particular afternoon, the sun was low and golden over an industrial stretch on the edge of the city, warehouses lining both sides of the road, the kind of place where traffic thinned out and engines could finally breathe. Naomi wore an ordinary riding jacket, a plain black helmet, gloves scuffed from years of use. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or rank. Nothing suggested she carried a badge that outranked nearly everyone who might stop her. She was simply a rider, enjoying an hour of freedom before the coming week buried her in briefs and hearings again. A police cruiser fell in behind her, lights flashing, and she signaled and pulled to the shoulder without hesitation, the way she had trained herself to do since she was a teenager. The officer who approached introduced himself as Kyle Mercer, 35 years old, broad-shouldered, walking with the stiff confidence of a man who believed every stop was an opportunity to prove something. He told her the motorcycle matched the description of one reported stolen 2 days earlier, and that she, in his words, matched the profile of someone who might be riding it without permission. From his very first sentence, his tone carried an assumption that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with what he expected a woman who looked like her to be doing on a machine that expensive. He asked where she had gotten the money for a bike like that. He asked if it was registered under her name or under someone else's. Naomi answered calmly, removed her helmet, and handed over her license, registration, and insurance card. Every document in perfect order, nothing about her file raising the slightest red flag. Kyle studied the papers longer than necessary, flipping them over as if searching for something that was not there, clearly unwilling to let the encounter end so quickly. He radioed in her plate and her license number, and while he waited for the response, he circled the motorcycle twice, running a gloved hand along the seat, crouching near the frame, looking for anything he could use to justify keeping her there. Naomi stood quietly beside her bike, hands visible, voice even, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to be fishing for. When the report came back clean, showing no theft, no violation, nothing but a spotless record, Kyle's jaw tightened, and instead of apologizing, he told her he still wanted to search the motorcycle before he let her go. The dispatcher's voice crackled through his radio a second time, confirming not only that the plate matched no stolen report, but that the registration traced back to an owner with no criminal history whatsoever, a detail that should have ended the stop right there on the spot. Kyle lingered near his cruiser for a moment, weighing the clean report against his own stubborn certainty that something about the situation still did not add up in his mind. He glanced back at Naomi. At the composed way, she stood beside her bike without a trace of nervousness, and somehow read that composure not as innocence, but as further proof of his own suspicion. It was a pattern he had followed before without consequence, treating calm confidence from certain people as evidence of guilt rather than what it actually was, an ordinary citizen simply waiting for an unjustified stop to end. Naomi asked him plainly what legal basis he had for a search when the vehicle check had already come back clear and no crime had been observed, and the question itself seemed to offend him more than any accusation could have. He told her that everyone had rights until they started acting like they had something to hide, and that her questions sounded exactly like the kind of thing guilty people said. Naomi did not raise her voice. She simply repeated that she would cooperate fully the moment he could show her a lawful reason, and that until then she was exercising the same right any citizen was entitled to exercise. 2 more patrol units arrived within minutes, drawn by Kyle's radio call for backup, their lights adding to the growing spectacle on the roadside. A handful of drivers slowed down to watch, and several pedestrians who had been walking nearby stopped to see what was happening, phones rising one after another to record the scene. Kyle pulled out a consent form and pushed it toward Naomi, telling her that signing it would make everything easier and faster for both of them. She read it carefully, then declined, explaining again that she would not consent to a search without proper legal grounds, and that her refusal was not defiance, but simply an exercise of a right that existed for a reason. The heat of the afternoon seemed to thicken the longer the standoff dragged on, sweat beading along Kyle's collar as his frustration mounted in front of an audience that kept growing by the minute. Every question Naomi asked, every calm clarification she offered, seemed to strike him not as reasonable, but as a personal challenge to his authority, and he began repeating himself louder each time, as though volume alone might finally make her comply. One bystander, an older man walking his dog, called out that the officer seemed to be escalating things for no clear reason, and Kyle shot him a look sharp enough to make the man fall silent and step back toward the curb. Another patrol officer, newer to the force, stood near his cruiser watching the exchange with visible discomfort, unsure whether to speak up or simply follow the lead of the more senior officers around him. Naomi noticed all of it, the phones, the murmurs, the uneasy silence of the officer who clearly sensed something was wrong, but she kept her focus fixed entirely on staying calm, aware that any flicker of frustration on her part would be used against her the moment it appeared on someone's recording. Kyle's patience unraveled visibly, his voice rising as he accused her of trying to obstruct a lawful investigation, though nothing about the stop had produced a single shred of lawful suspicion beyond his own assumptions. He told the gathering onlookers that she was being uncooperative, framing her calm insistence on procedure as hostility toward the badge itself. It was at that moment that Sergeant Daniel Ross arrived on the scene, 50 years old, heavy-set, with the weary authority of a man who had spent decades learning exactly how far he could bend the rules without anyone above him noticing. Ross listened to Kyle's version of events for less than a minute before making his decision, and rather than diffusing the tension building on that roadside, he chose to reinforce it. He looked at Naomi, still holding her documents, still composed, and told Kyle to place her in handcuffs for what he called her own safety and everyone else's. Naomi asked him directly what charge justified the arrest, and Ross offered no answer beyond a dismissive wave of his hand, telling her she could sort that out down at the station. The cold metal closed around her wrists in front of a crowd that had grown to nearly 24 people, most of them filming, some murmuring in disbelief at what they were witnessing unfold. Naomi did not resist, did not raise her voice, did not struggle against the cuffs digging into her skin. She simply stood straighter, looked directly at Kyle, and told him in a clear, steady voice that she was Judge Naomi Brooks of the United States Federal Court, and that he needed to think very carefully about what he was doing. In that moment, She allowed herself exactly one thought that had nothing to do with procedure or law. A brief flash of memory from years earlier, back when she was a young public defender walking into courtrooms where nobody expected her to win. She remembered the countless clients she had represented, who stood exactly where she now stood, handcuffed on the strength of an officer's assumption rather than any actual evidence, and how often the system had simply believed the badge over the person wearing none. She understood, with a clarity that steadied rather than shook her, that everything she said and did in the next few minutes would either confirm every doubt the crowd already held about people who looked like her, or it would stand as proof of exactly the opposite. So she breathed, straightened her shoulders beneath the weight of the cuffs, and waited, refusing to let the indignity of the moment become the whole of her story. Kyle laughed out loud, an ugly, dismissive sound that carried across the road, and turned to the small audience as if inviting them to share the joke. He told her that anyone could claim to be a judge, that criminals lied about their identities every single day, and that a badge and a title meant nothing without proof standing in a parking lot on the side of a highway. A few people in the crowd murmured their agreement, assuming she was simply another person caught in a lie, desperate to talk her way out of trouble the way so many others tried and failed to do. Ross ordered a tow truck to haul the motorcycle away, treating the entire scene as though it were already resolved, already just another routine arrest to file and forget. Naomi, still cuffed, asked only for one thing, calmly and without pleading, requesting permission to make a single phone call before they took her anywhere. Kyle refused outright, telling her that calls happened at the station, not on the side of the road, and that she had lost the privilege of negotiating the moment she refused to cooperate. It was in that exact window of time that a younger officer standing near the edge of the group, quiet until then, pulled out his phone and typed her name into the department database out of nothing more than habit and curiosity. His face changed almost instantly, the color draining from it as the search results loaded, confirming everything Naomi had just said, and adding details that made the situation infinitely worse than anyone standing there had imagined. He tried to get Ross's attention, tapping his sergeant's shoulder urgently, but before he could finish his sentence, the low rumble of heavy engines rolled in from down the road. For a moment, nobody on that roadside seemed to know what was happening. The young officer's stammered warning lost beneath the noise of engines drawing closer with every second. Ross turned toward the sound, his instincts telling him something about the approaching vehicles did not belong to any routine call he had ever responded to before. Kyle, still standing near the tow truck operator, barely glanced up, too consumed by his own irritation to register the shift rippling through everyone else around him. Naomi alone seemed unsurprised, her expression unreadable behind the calm she had maintained since the moment the cuffs first closed around her wrists, as though some quiet part of her had known all along that the truth would not stay buried on the side of that road for long. 3 black federal SUVs turned onto the scene in tight formation, moving with the kind of precision that told everyone present this was not a coincidence and not a routine patrol passing through. Doors opened before the vehicles had even fully stopped, and men and women in dark jackets stepped out with the calm, deliberate confidence of people who had done this exact thing many times before. At the front of them walked United States Marshal Ethan Cole, 45 years old, tall, unhurried, his eyes moving across the scene, and landing immediately on the handcuffed woman standing beside a partially loaded tow truck. Cole asked, in a voice that carried without needing to be raised, who was in charge of the scene, and Kyle stepped forward with visible confusion, still clinging to the assumption that he held the upper hand. Ross tried to explain, his tone shifting from authority to something closer to caution, sensing before he understood exactly why that the ground beneath him had just shifted. Cole produced identification and a set of documents that confirmed, beyond any possible dispute, that the woman standing in handcuffs was indeed a sitting federal judge, protected under specific statutes that made what had just happened far more serious than anyone on that roadside had grasped. The marshals moved with the kind of efficient calm that came from years of handling situations far more volatile than this one, spreading out around the scene without a single raised voice, their presence alone enough to quiet the murmuring crowd almost instantly. One agent began speaking quietly with the bystanders who had recorded the encounter, asking politely whether they would be willing to share their footage as part of an official record, while another moved toward the tow truck operator to halt the removal of the motorcycle before it could be driven away. Cole himself remained close to Naomi throughout, his manner respectful but unhurried, treating the moment with the seriousness it demanded rather than rushing to smooth it over for the sake of appearances. Word of what was unfolding traveled quickly among the assembled officers, several of whom exchanged uneasy glances, aware that whatever came next would not stay confined to a quiet internal memo. Kyle's face went pale as the weight of the moment settled over him, the laughter from minutes earlier now feeling like it belonged to a different, far more foolish version of himself. Ross began stammering an explanation about protocol, about matching descriptions, about following procedure, but his voice lacked the confidence it carried. Only minutes before, when he had ordered the cuffs onto her wrists, Naomi, still restrained, said only one thing that cut through the chaos more sharply than any accusation could have. She told them not to remove the handcuffs yet, insisting that everything that happened next needed to be documented exactly as it occurred, with no shortcuts taken and no attempt made to quietly smooth over what had already unfolded in front of dozens of witnesses. It was a request rooted not in anger, but in her understanding of exactly how systems like this one tended to protect themselves when given the chance. Within the hour, Captain Melissa Grant, 47 years old, head of the department's Internal Affairs Division, received a call summoning her directly to the scene, and the moment she arrived, she understood this would not be a simple matter of writing up one officer's mistake. Melissa Grant had built her career on a reputation for integrity in a department that did not always reward it, and the file that landed on her desk that evening felt heavier than most. She ordered every scrap of footage preserved immediately, from the dashboard cameras in each patrol car, to the body cameras worn by every officer present, to the traffic cameras mounted along that stretch of road, and to any recordings captured by the bystanders who had filmed the encounter on their phones. Nothing was to be deleted, nothing was to be edited, and nothing was to disappear into the kind of administrative fog that had swallowed complaints before. As her team began pulling records that night, a pattern emerged far faster than Melissa expected, one that stretched back well beyond that single afternoon on the roadside. Kyle Mercer's history showed repeated stops that skirted the edges of legality, disproportionately targeting certain neighborhoods and certain kinds of drivers, complaints filed and then quietly closed without meaningful review. Sergeant Ross's name appeared again and again as the officer who signed off on those closures, always finding a technical reason to dismiss the concerns before they could climb any higher up the chain. As her team began pulling records that night, a pattern emerged far faster than Melissa expected, one that stretched back well beyond that single afternoon on the roadside. Kyle Mercer's history showed repeated stops that skirted the edges of legality, disproportionately targeting certain neighborhoods and certain kinds of drivers, complaints filed and then quietly closed without meaningful review. Sergeant Ross's name appeared again and again as the officer who signed off on those closures, always finding a technical reason to dismiss the concerns before they could climb any higher up the chain. Melissa cross-referenced years of dispatch logs against formal complaints filed by citizens, and the discrepancies she found were staggering, entire incident numbers that existed in one system but had vanished from another. She pulled personnel files, financial disclosure forms, and overtime records, building a timeline that stretched back nearly 6 years, long before Kyle Mercer had even joined the department. Several retired officers, contacted quietly and off the record, admitted they had once raised concerns about certain patrol patterns near the industrial district, only to be told the matter had been handled and to let it go. Each conversation added another thread to a picture that was steadily becoming impossible to explain away as coincidence or isolated misconduct. By the second night, Melissa had filled an entire wall of her office with printed timelines, photographs, and financial charts, stepping back at nearly 2 a.m. to survey the scope of what she had uncovered with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet disbelief. Reports had been rewritten, key details softened or omitted entirely, and citizens who tried to formally complain found their paperwork lost or their claims dismissed for lack of evidence that had somehow never made it into the file. Melissa Grant, poring over the documents late into the night, with a strong cup of coffee going cold beside her, began to understand that what she was looking at was not the story of one bad stop by one overzealous officer. It was the visible edge of something far larger, something deliberately built and carefully maintained, and buried inside the financial records tied to several of these dismissed cases was a name that kept surfacing, no matter how many layers she peeled back. Victor Kane. Victor Kane was 55 years old, a businessman well known around the city for his charitable donations, his sponsorship of youth sports leagues, and his warm smile in newspaper photographs, standing beside local officials at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Behind that public image, Kane ran an operation that moved stolen and fraudulently retitled vehicles through a network of dealerships he quietly controlled, laundering the proceeds through businesses that looked entirely legitimate on paper. To keep that operation running smoothly, he needed certain police officers who would look the other way, certain sergeants who would bury the paperwork, and certain silences that money alone could not guarantee without cooperation from inside the department itself. Kane had built his empire slowly over more than a decade, starting with a single used car lot before expanding into a chain of dealerships spread across 3 counties, each one appearing entirely ordinary to anyone who walked through the front door. Behind the showroom floors, vehicles reported stolen in neighboring states arrived under cover of night, their identification numbers altered, their paperwork forged by a small team of specialists who answered only to Kane himself. He cultivated relationships carefully, choosing officers who seemed financially strained or professionally overlooked, offering them small favors at first, before gradually drawing them deeper into arrangements they found increasingly difficult to walk away from. His public generosity was not simply for show, it was strategy, a way of ensuring that anyone who might one day question his operations would have to weigh that suspicion against a reputation built on years of visible community goodwill. Few people who shook his hand at charity dinners ever imagined that the same man funding scholarships for local students was also funding a criminal network that had quietly touched dozens of lives in far darker ways. Kyle Mercer, it turned out, was little more than a low-level piece in that machine, a man who received small favors and occasional cash in exchange for making sure particular vehicles and particular routes stayed free of scrutiny. Ross was the coordinator, the man who matched officers to opportunities and made sure the paper trail always pointed somewhere else whenever questions were asked. Naomi Brooks, in her years on the bench, had signed off on several investigative warrants connected loosely to Kane's businesses, cases that always seemed to stall just before they reached anything conclusive, evidence that always seemed to go missing at the worst possible moment. She had suspected for a long time, and she had never imagined the proof would eventually walk straight out of her own unlawful arrest. The very stop that Kyle Mercer had orchestrated to intimidate a woman he assumed was powerless had instead handed investigators the first clean thread they needed to start unraveling the entire tapestry Kane had spent years weaving. Once Melissa Grant's internal findings reached the appropriate desks, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was formally brought into the case, and the scope of the inquiry expanded almost overnight, from a single roadside incident into a sprawling, coordinated investigation touching dozens of officers, several businesses, and one very nervous businessman who had never expected his name to surface this way. Federal agents worked alongside Internal Affairs and the United States Attorney's Office, pooling resources in a way that made it far harder for anyone inside the department to quietly interfere. Judges signed search warrants for financial records. Wiretaps were authorized on phones belonging to several key figures, and surveillance teams began tracking movements that had, for years, gone completely unnoticed by anyone in a position to stop them. Bank accounts revealed transfers disguised as consulting fees and equipment purchases. Encrypted messages showed coordination between officers and Kane's associates that left little room for innocent explanation, and hidden cameras placed near several of Kane's dealerships captured meetings that no legitimate business would ever need to conduct in the shadows of a closed parking garage after midnight. Word of the investigation's growing scope reached Kane through a contact inside the courthouse who had, until then, remained unaware that his own name had already surfaced in the financial records under review. Kane responded by tightening his circle, cutting off communication with several associates he no longer trusted, and shifting large sums of money through a final round of accounts before the trail could close entirely around him. He told himself, as he had told himself many times over the years, whenever suspicion crept close, that money and patience had always been enough to make problems disappear, and that this situation would prove no different. What he failed to account for was the sheer volume of documentation Melissa Grant's team had already compiled. Evidence gathered not from a single dramatic breakthrough, but from months of patient, methodical work that left almost nothing to chance. Piece by piece, the picture assembled itself with a clarity that surprised even the investigators who had spent months chasing it, revealing a network far larger than a handful of dishonest cops and one greedy businessman. There were connections to auto theft rings operating across 3 counties, ties to a chop shop disguised as a legitimate repair business, and a chain of falsified vehicle titles stretching back nearly 6 years. As the walls closed in, Victor Kane began making arrangements to leave the country, quietly transferring funds offshore and booking travel under a name that was not his own, sensing the ground shifting beneath him long before most of his associates did. Agents assigned to the financial thread of the case traced payments moving through shell companies registered in 3 different states, each one designed to obscure the trail back to Kane's core dealerships. A forensic accountant working with the Bureau discovered that nearly $2 million had passed through a single account disguised as a charitable foundation, money that never actually reached any of the causes listed in its public filings. Surveillance teams, watching one of Kane's associates, captured a late-night meeting in a parking garage where documents changed hands, later confirmed to be blank vehicle titles, awaiting forged signatures. Meanwhile, the wiretaps authorized on Ross's personal phone picked up conversations in which he coached other officers on how to phrase their reports to avoid drawing further attention, conversations that would later become some of the most damaging evidence presented in court. Every new piece of evidence tightened the circle a little further, and inside the Bureau's temporary command center, investigators began referring to the case simply as the network, aware that they were no longer chasing a handful of bad actors, but dismantling an entire criminal ecosystem built over years of careful, patient corruption. Sergeant Ross, growing increasingly desperate as internal affairs requests multiplied, attempted to destroy physical records stored in his own home, shredding documents late at night and wiping devices he believed no one would think to examine. Kyle Mercer, meanwhile, found himself sitting alone in his apartment replaying that roadside stop over and over, slowly understanding that he had been little more than a disposable pawn in a machine he never fully understood, used and discarded the moment his usefulness ran out. Investigators, working against a narrowing window before evidence could vanish entirely, finalized plans for a coordinated series of raids designed to strike every major target at once, leaving no time for warnings to pass between them. In the hours just before dawn, more than 100 federal agents moved simultaneously across the city, converging on Victor Kane's home, his network of dealerships, and the residences of several implicated officers, including Sergeant Ross himself. Kane was taken into custody attempting to leave through a side entrance of his property, a packed suitcase and a bag of cash sitting in the trunk of his car as agents closed in around him. Ross was arrested at his kitchen table, still surrounded by the shredded remains of documents he had failed to destroy in time, his hands shaking as agents read him his rights in a voice far calmer than the moment deserved. The operation had been planned down to the minute, with teams positioned outside every target location well before the sun began to rise, waiting for a single coordinated signal to move in at once. Streets that were normally quiet at that hour filled with the low hum of idling vehicles, agents in tactical vests checking their watches as the final seconds ticked away. When the signal came, doors were breached almost simultaneously across 4 different parts of the city, the element of surprise ensuring that no warning could travel between the targets before it was too late. At one of Kane's dealerships, agents discovered an entire back room hidden behind a false wall, stacked floor to ceiling with vehicle parts bearing altered identification numbers. At another location, a safe hidden beneath a floorboard yielded stacks of cash bundled by denomination, alongside a small notebook listing payments that would later prove instrumental in tracing the full extent of the network's reach. Across the city, several other officers were taken into custody that same morning, some quietly, some in scenes that drew crowds of stunned neighbors, watching handcuffed men in uniform, led out of homes they had lived in for years. Federal agents recovered storage units filled with cash, hard drives containing years of falsified records, burner phones loaded with incriminating messages, and a handwritten ledger detailing payments made to more than a dozen officers over an extended period of time. News of the operation spread through the city within hours, television crews gathering outside the department's headquarters, as officials confirmed that a long-running corruption network had been dismantled in a single coordinated strike. Residents who had long suspected something was wrong within their local police force finally saw those suspicions confirmed, on a scale far larger than most of them had imagined possible. Kyle Mercer, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in federal prison, chose to cooperate fully with investigators, providing detailed testimony about how the network operated and who else had been involved at every level. His cooperation, combined with the mountain of physical and digital evidence already gathered, allowed prosecutors to build cases against nearly everyone connected to Kane's operation, with a speed that surprised even the investigators who had spent months assembling the pieces. Captain Melissa Grant compiled a comprehensive report detailing every failure within the department that had allowed the corruption to fester for as long as it had, recommending sweeping reforms to oversight procedures, complaint reviews, and officer accountability measures. Naomi Brooks, mindful of the obvious conflict of interest created by her own unlawful arrest, recused herself entirely from presiding over any related proceedings, insisting that a different judge handle every case connected to that single afternoon on the roadside. A colleague from a neighboring district was assigned to preside instead, ensuring that justice moved forward without even the appearance of personal involvement clouding the outcome. Over the following months, plea agreements and convictions steadily worked their way through the courts, with Victor Kane accepting a lengthy prison sentence in exchange for cooperation that helped investigators trace even more of his financial network. Sergeant Ross received a sentence that reflected both his role in the corruption and his attempts to obstruct the investigation once it began closing in around him. Millions of dollars in assets tied to the stolen vehicle operation were seized and returned wherever possible to the people and institutions who had been defrauded, while the police department itself entered a period of public and difficult reform. The reforms Melissa Grant recommended were adopted almost in full, including a new independent review board with the authority to investigate complaints without requiring approval from any supervisor inside the chain of command. Body camera footage could no longer be deleted or overwritten without triggering an automatic audit, and every citizen complaint was now assigned a permanent case number the moment it was filed, making it far harder for future officers to quietly bury concerns the way Ross once had. Training programs were overhauled to address the kind of bias that had shaped Kyle Mercer's very first assumptions on that roadside, focusing not on abstract policy language, but on the real, documented consequences that bias had produced. Several honest officers who had once tried and failed to raise concerns about the department's culture were promoted into newly created oversight roles, their years of quiet persistence finally given the weight it had always deserved. The department, for the first time in years, began publishing its complaint outcomes publicly, a small but significant step toward rebuilding the trust that had eroded so quietly for so long. On the day Victor Kane stood before the court to hear his sentence read aloud, the gallery was packed with reporters, former employees, and a handful of people whose vehicles had once passed silently through his network without their knowledge. He showed little emotion as the judge, a colleague Naomi had known for years, detailed the scope of the fraud and the years of quiet suffering it had caused. People who never knew their names had been tied to a criminal enterprise. Kyle Mercer testified 2 weeks later in a separate proceeding, his voice unsteady as he described, in plain terms, how easily he had been drawn into a system that rewarded silence and punished questions. He did not ask for sympathy, only acknowledged that his own assumptions on that roadside had been the spark that, however unintentionally, brought the entire structure crashing down around the very people who had built it. Ross, for his part, said almost nothing during his own sentencing, staring at the table in front of him as the consequences of years of quiet compromise were finally read into the permanent record. Officers who had spent years quietly reporting concerns, only to watch them disappear into Ross's careful cover-ups, finally saw their integrity recognized, some receiving commendations for persistence that had gone unrewarded for far too long. New oversight structures were put in place, designed specifically to prevent any single sergeant or supervisor from ever again holding the kind of unchecked power that had allowed the corruption to spread as far as it had. Through it all, Naomi Brooks returned to her courtroom exactly as she always had, calm, precise, and utterly unwilling to let the incident define how she carried herself in a profession she had spent decades earning the right to belong to. Several months later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, Naomi rode her motorcycle along that same stretch of road near the industrial district, the engine humming beneath her the same way it always had. A young officer, patrolling the area on routine duty, noticed her slow near an intersection and offered a polite nod as she passed, waiting patiently for her to merge before continuing on his way. He had no idea who she was, no idea about the events that had unfolded there months earlier, and that was precisely the point, because his courtesy came not from recognizing a title, but from simply extending basic respect to another person on the road. The road itself looked almost unchanged from that afternoon months earlier. The same warehouses lining the shoulder, the same long stretch of open pavement catching the late sunlight, and yet everything about how Naomi moved through it felt different now. She thought briefly of Kyle Mercer, who was now serving out the terms of his own plea agreement, cooperating still with prosecutors working through the remaining threads of Kane's network. She thought of Sergeant Ross, whose name had once carried enough weight to end a conversation with a single word, now reduced to a case number in a federal facility. She thought, too, of the countless people who had stood on roadsides, just like this one over the years, in that same city, without a title powerful enough to summon 3 black SUVs before the worst could happen to them, and she understood that her own case had only mattered as much as it did because of the office she held, a truth that unsettled her, even as the reforms moved forward. Naomi smiled beneath her helmet, something in that small, unremarkable exchange, settling a weight she had carried quietly since that afternoon in handcuffs. She slowed her bike near the federal courthouse, where she had spent nearly a decade of her career, gazing up at its familiar columns, bathed in the soft light of a late afternoon sun. The law, she thought, was never strong because of the power held by those who enforced it, but because of the willingness of every single person within that system to apply it equally, without exception, without shortcuts, and without regard for who stood in front of them. She lingered there for a long moment, engine idling quietly beneath her, before easing back onto the road and continuing on toward wherever the afternoon would take her next. The city moved around her the way it always had, unaware of how close an entire hidden network had once come to remaining buried forever, unaware of how a single unjust stop on an empty road had become the very thread that unraveled it all. One act of abused power had been enough to wound a single person standing alone on the side of a highway, but the truth, once protected and pursued by the law rather than buried beneath it, had proven strong enough to bring down an entire criminal empire in the span of a single night. Justice, in the end, was never about the badge someone wore or the color of the skin beneath it, but about whether every person within the system, from the newest officer on patrol to the most senior judge on the bench, remained willing to follow the law and answer for their actions when they did not. That truth rode quietly down the road with Naomi Brooks that afternoon, carried not in words but in the simple, steady way she kept moving forward, unshaken, unwilling to let anger define what integrity had already won.